Back in 2010, there were fewer charter schools. The two green dots on the screen represent two charter schools in a northeastern city. They were new. They were punk rock. For me, charter schools would have been the kids in high school wearing Doc Martens, listening to college radio. In the beginning, charter schools were actually a union idea. The president of the American Federation of Teachers, Al Shanker, envisioned them as innovative schools started by teachers without administrators to destroy bureaucracy. And if they failed, they wouldn't be renewed. Then people used the legislation to open schools to serve as an intervention to failing school districts while offering choice. The rallying cry was one of civil rights. As they started getting great results, community members and funders asked them to open more. Soon, the schools grew from 2 schools to 7, feeding into a high school of 1,200 students. Makes sense, right? We all want good schools. But then, the talent inventory became an issue. In his 2014 Impresario workshop, Seth Godin discusses the difference between the hard audience and the easy audience. A hard audience is one that is selected very carefully. It's somewhat elitist. It's not for everyone. All the people who are there to be with like-minded people to make change happen. They willingly join a movement. This concept is true of employees, organizations, and teams. In the early days of chartering, staff were a hard audience. Schools were independent, edgy, and good. You signed up to be a part of it. But as schools became networks, it became more difficult to fill positions for the simple fact that it's difficult to get that many people into positions without changing some of the standards. When Seth discusses the easy audience, he means an audience of everyone. It's an open invitation. To increase the size of the crowd, you offer incentives because you need mass participation. The same could be said for hiring when you're trying to grow, scale, and fill positions as a charter network. But there's a consequence. Let's look at the scatter plot to evaluate that consequence. This scatter plot is of a national charter school network that has grown rapidly. In the upper right quadrant, where you see the green dots, are the schools that have excellent academic growth and decent absolute academic results. Many of the schools are near the home office, and one is out of state. In the left lower quadrant, most of the schools are low growth, low proficiency, and that's not good. That's not what you want to scale. Quick note, when the network wants to grow another school, they don't use a scatter plot to provide evidence of quality. Instead, they use bar graphs to show proficiency and growth. The schools in the upper right quadrant boost the average performance for all. How do I know? I've written a charter application and done the same. So authorizers, if a charter applicant shows bar graphs, ask to see scatter plots from NWEA MAP if the school uses that assessment. It's a great quality check and tells a better story to understand the student's experience. It's one of the most honest visualizations there are. Many of the schools in the upper right are different than others in the network. Just look here. Many of the kids belong to a 2-parent Asian immigrant household. In fact, the schools may not have had to work too hard at all. Much of the quality could have been the product of the family being stable. But the schools in the lower left quadrant are different altogether. But you can't see this in the reports because using averages hides this. There's likely a quality issue because there's a talent issue. Newly appointed principals lead newer teachers who are likely recruited by the network and were promised support and development and incentivized with junior leadership titles. The organization had to go from the hard audience strategy to the easy audience strategy to fill seats and positions. Everyone is invited and incentivized. Some people are poached from smaller, more effective schools by money and titles and unkeepable promises. This is a headache for the CEO who wants to serve kids well but also wants to grow. So what does he or she do? Well, he or she adds support and management structures to ensure the work gets done at a high level. Here's his C-suite. These are often the centralized decision makers for the organization. What they say goes. And often there's little to zero decision-making rights granted to the schools and principals. Here are the 18 principals who each have 1.4 years experience on average and manage teams of 3 to 5 deans or assistant principals. This network grew from 3 schools to 18 schools in 6 years, from kindergarten through 12th grade. Because these principals and their teams lack experience, they're often not trusted to do well. They're often not trusted to make decisions, so they must execute a play given to them by the C-suite. Regardless of the program's efficacy, just run the play. Because if you don't, you could get fired, even if the principal was right. And if you run the play and it's not effective, no worries. The principal really can't be held responsible because it was not their decision. To help run the play comes a layer of functional teams and other middle managers and bureaucrats. They oversee that the execution is happening. Climbing to these positions becomes the goal of many at the school level, making the workplace competitive and very, very political. People want out of the schools and into the bureaucracy. Ambitious adults looking for professional development, flexible time, but in doing so they lose sight of the real work that revolves around kids. Now that the bureaucracy is large, even complicated, there are more gaps, skill gaps, culture gaps, system gaps, and more. So the C-suite then engages consultants to help them fix the gaps. There's a consultant for principal development and professional development, a reading coach, an implementation specialist, a math consultant, a test and data consultant, a DEI and staff engagement consultant, a strategy and scalability consultant, and sometimes even a lobbyist. This is paid for by tax dollars and per pupil revenues. And because these schools are nonprofits, donors also provide capital, especially if the organization continues to grow and push certain agendas. And yet the quality does not vastly improve. The growth made gaps happen, and kids suffer for it. But don't worry, there's always a consultant that can fill the gaps created by the org's greed for growth. It's expensive, though. And the board to whom the leader reports is okay with it and okay with the mediocre results. The man in the green is a fictional board president. He's a retired CFO and been the chair for 10 years. He's obviously okay with mediocre. Otherwise, why is the CEO still there? In fact, sometimes it's not the board who manages the CEO, but the CEO who manages the board. Selecting members strategically for their power and influence in the sector and community because they won't hold the CEO accountable. The CEO will sometimes push members out. Some national organizations don't even have local governing boards at all. They make decisions for people 1,000 miles away. Sometimes I'm not sure that these organizations really care about kids. Just look at that scatter plot again. In this episode, we covered how charter schools were kind of punk rock and revolutionary in the early days. You opted into the movement to work with like-minded people, and the teams were small, and it was intense. But as communities grew into networks, it became difficult to find the same caliber of like-minded people. So they had to change standards, they had to recruit, incentivize, steal talent, and form bureaucracies with top-down decision-making to scale quality. And many kids suffer, given the same quality of education as the district that they left. And sure, we can say that charters are a great alternative because 30% of the kids in charters are academically proficient versus districts where it's like 20%. But is that really great? No, it's not. Of course not. Where I live, there's a handful of smaller, local charter communities who are doing tremendous work. If I were to summarize what the beauty is of these small charter organizations, it would be this. They know a school is its people. It's not a building, it's not about the program, it's the people. So now, let's answer our important questions. Were there any gaps made as the schools grew into large networks? And can the intervention district of consultants fill them? Well, we know that the education consulting economy is growing. There's a ton of them. They're growing by the billion. So of course there's a solution. Just ask her. For the mediocre large network who started small and with the right intent, they believe there are always fixes for the gaps because they have the money. They add in layers of middle management, then they add in consultants to fill in the gaps because quality growth is hard to do if you don't have the right people in your organization. And the right people are those who are aligned with the original vision and the original methods. Many of these organizations centralize. Why? Because the people at the top don't trust those in schools who actually execute. What's more dehumanizing is that when organizations signal that they value diversity and they hire for racial equity, and then they don't allow these leaders to make decisions, and they don't allow these leaders to exercise creativity and do what's best for their schools, well, that's just shameful. If I were bold, I'd actually say that it's kind of racist. But they fill gaps by putting in more bureaucracy, and it's expensive. Like $9 million just for that model I shared. Are there any courage gaps that we need to fill? Yeah, authorizers, you need to show some courage. Talking to you. You need to ask better questions about the data of charter schools. You need to ask for scatter plots to show how quality is scaled across their whole portfolio, especially if the organization is centralized. Why? Because it's easy to hide in averages. But it's not just that, authorizers. You need to exercise courage when it comes to renewing charter schools. Only renew those who succeed, who meet their goals. If they don't meet their goals, shut them down. That's the original spirit of the movement. Some courage for networks. You need to ask better questions of yourselves for how to scale quality in a manner that's not so bureaucratic. Because once you start adding people, gaps are going to happen. Once you start lowering standards of your people, gaps are going to happen. Why not read Safi Bakal's Loonshots? It's brilliant. One of his big points is that when organizations have over 150 employees, they stop thinking about strong ideas and they start becoming political. People start thinking about positional power and getting up high in the organization. Instead of thinking about big bureaucracies, how about think about micro districts? Right? That's something a little bit different. Because right now it feels like we are exercising lazy thinking. And I know that within charter organizations, we have some of the most brilliant minds. In networks, show courage by willing to say no to growth. As much as you want to grow, say no to it if you're not ready. It's hard to say no, but it's the right thing to do sometimes. And I want to re-emphasize Sophie Bruchal's point. Again, it is when the number of employees of an organization reaches 150 that politics become more important than ideas. So yes, play around with sizes. It makes sense. We just need to be more creative. Then add in something like Jocko Willink's decentralized command, which allows leaders and team members at every level to make a contribution to the mission. But we don't. And I don't know if we're ever going to exercise that kind of courage. Why? Because the people at the top don't trust those who execute. The courage gap is the only gap that consultants cannot fix. Get loud when necessary, because the last few years there have been people who've been self-censoring and other people who have brought bad ideas into education. The potential to change K-12 is hidden in your silence, and now it's time to talk.